Hello, welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing my 14.24 ADC tier list, so if you enjoy content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a couple of changes this patch. Most notably, we saw nerfs towards Corki and Swain, and then Victor's presence within the bot lane has exponentially gone up with his ASU slash VGU, so I do want to cover that. The D tier then is going to consist of one champion at the moment, and that is Kalista. I believe Kalista is still a viable option in Elite and competitive. She is a lot more built around her synergies with support, her early game aggression, and these things are just not going to be as approachable in mid and low elo, which is why she maintains a spot in the D tier. I believe this is probably correct long term for Kalista. Obviously, if they can, I believe they should try and make her more accessible for the average player, but not to the point where they egregiously change her kit. The C tier event is going to have Twitch moving up. He is better this patch. The buff was fairly minimal. It wasn't a huge change, but the duration increase on Q combined with the attack speed increase is nice. It activates from level 1. You are putting a point in Q traditionally at level 1, and then you'll have access to the attack speed and duration throughout the entire game. So it's, albeit looks small on paper and isn't huge, it does do something to like shift him a bit, so he does go up to the C tier. Samira is very close to dropping down to the D tier. I think this champion's in a really rough spot at the moment. Really predicated on early advantages, snowballing, synergies. Albeit, I think she should be better for solo queue than something like a Kalista, especially in the lower ranks. She is still slightly elite skewed, slightly built around laning phase, and she's in a really rough spot. So I might move her down to the D tier, depending on whether long term she stays in this spot. But with the changes coming next season, and this being the last time, like covering season 14, Samira is going to maintain her spot in the C tier. Tristana is also within the C tier. I believed this champion would gain a bit more over time, like ever since she received her changes, but she seems to have kind of flatlined a bit like a C tier champion. I still think she can be a very viable bot laner, and the buffs she received after being adjusted did help her quite a bit to kind of find her footing here. And if you can play her and you're successful on her, she can still be a very decent pick, but I don't believe she's close to I mean, she's definitely a higher C tier option, but she's not close to really competing with some of the higher options at the moment, especially if you're not really pushing your advantages and like leveraging early kills. Lucian also within the C tier. I also think Lucian probably sits towards the lower part of this tier. He's also not really found his footing in Split 3. There's a lot of marksmen like that. Like, I don't believe that, Lucian, Samira, outside of, like, Collector being really strong for Samira, have really found where they want to be. I think Lucian's still playable. Like, I think most ADCs are in a playable state. They're just gonna be weaker and less performant than the ones in the tiers above. Zeri I also have in the C tier. With the Static Shiv and Flicker Blades change it. Flicker Blades? Not Flicker Blades. The other item, Yuntal's Wild Arrows. She did gain a bit there, and she definitely sits as more like a high C tier option, but not really enough to push her up the tier list more. She still requires very high demand of execution to be able to output a huge amount of DPS and act as a hyper carry in those late game team fights, and that kind of prohibits her from being in the higher tiers at the moment. Varus is a really strong elite pick. I think this champion gains where a lot of the others don't at the moment. Like a lot of these other C tier picks I wouldn't say are particularly much better in the higher ranks. Varus, I do think, exponentially grows as a pick. The lower rank you go, the less people are going to set up around your ultimate, the less people are going to play for the strengths of the champion. He does have really good harass, and you can, if you're like comboing your abilities correctly, be a really oppressive champion. That combined with like some build variations, albeit Lethality is in a pretty weak spot at the moment with Yomu's and Opportunity both being nerfed to range, and Opportunity just not being in a great spot full stop, did hurt that build. But I would really just recommend going on here. We've actually seen like Ginsu's Rush really pop up as being like a very viable option for Varus, but you still have like Bork and Kakenseo as like fallback patterns if you're not as comfortable on the Ginsu's Rush. He sits as a high C tier option. I do believe he does grow quite quickly as you go into the higher ranks though. So if you want to put the time into Varus, you can. He is being changed going into next season though. Aphelios maintains a spot within the C tier. He still very much demands like good knowledge of his weapon rotations, making sure you're maximizing DPS, as he is a hyper carry marksman. He is mainly prohibited by his by that demand, and obviously being in a mobile carry can feel quite frustrating, especially if you don't have the tools and people to really peel you, which is arguably why he can't really rise up as a higher option. I do think this champion, once you master him, though, is a very solid marksman, and if you're in a Aphelios one trick at the moment, he's in a pretty good spot for you, so he can definitely like rise up the tier list, but I'm going to leave him in the C tier for the moment, as this is targeted towards more mid and low elo. Now, one champion dropping down, and that is Kaiser. Kaiser, over the last couple of patches, has just been like gradually becoming less performant. I still like the fact that she has 2 build variations in both the on hit and the AP. AP is obviously going to be a bit more niche and requires like good setup and good conditions to run. On hits, like her traditional, like your static into Ginsu's build. You don't really see just raw AD Kaiser anymore. It's not really what people opt into, but yeah, the static Ginsu Nasha core, if you're operating Kaiser well, she can still be very valuable. I still really think she can be quite warping in certain spots with the like dive onto backline, the setup, the fact that she can like play onto setup so easily, combined with like the ranged harass and the burst damage of a champion. There's still definitely strengths to it, and I think akin to like the other 2 champions here, I think she could definitely rise up the tier list, unlike some of the other ones slightly lower than her. The B tier then is going to be led by Smolder. The champion is in a fine spot, honestly. I think he is balanced, quotation marks. It can be quite oppressive if you give him a lot of gold. He's definitely been pushed more towards being a gold scaler. You have the 2 build variations in both the Hubris and the Essence Reaver, and then you're opting into things like Shojins. I know some people still like the Manamunes, and then things like RFC and BT can be like good items to wrap up your build, and I'd say he's a solid beta option. If you're comfortable on the pick, he can definitely be valuable. Does tend to spike at a different time to more traditional marksman, but can still be a very solid option for you. His wave clear is slightly nerfed though, so you do just have to be slightly cognitive of that. Ezreal, if you can pilot him well, very valuable pick. Great safety tool in the E. Can output huge amounts of DPS if you're like consistently rotating Qs and landing them, if you're positioning your abilities correctly. Requires decent game knowledge and game game mechanics rather. But if you have, like, if you're very comfortable on this, on these, kind of topics, then Ezreal can be a great champion for you and can definitely be a very functional ADC at the moment. I think he can, really shift around depending on, how well you pilot the pick. He can drop all the way to the D tier. He can be, an S tier pick if you pilot him well. Xayah is a great response champion, great into dive, has very valuable self-peel tools. Isn't usually going to output the same level of DPS as, a hyper carry, but can output a lot of DPS. By no means is she a weak ADC. She does have that going for her, kind of akin to an Ashe. She has the traditional reason why you play her, but can still act as a very high damage threat if given a lot of resources. So solid beta pick at the moment. Draven relies very, very heavily on early aggression and snowballing, kind of akin to Corki. Corki is an easier version of Draven in my opinion. They kind of have very similar goals within the game. If you can really snowball advantages, they can be really valuable, and if you close out games they can early, then they can really enable you to climb. Obviously these champions exponentially climb the higher ranks you go as the games are shorter, and they're going to have more value in, compared to the game length of the game. So definitely higher up you go, more valuable these picks are. The lower down you go, they can still function. Corki, I do think, is a relatively easy and simple champion to pick up. So I do have him as a solid beta option at the moment, even with the nerfs to his E flat damage and E AD ratio. Yasuo and Vayne wrap up the B tier. I do think Vayne's kind of underrated at the moment. The champion's definitely benefited from her more recent buffs and then shifts around within the ADC role. I don't think she's the best ADC in the game, but she definitely has certain builds she can go with. We've seen Trinity variations, we've seen crit variations, we've seen on hit variations. She can definitely be a bit more adaptable at the moment, and I definitely do think this champion in isolation in 1v1 situations or with a decent amount of gold can be a very valuable pick towards your draft. So don't sleep on the champion, especially if you do play it and have good understanding of the champion. She can definitely help you climb. In Yasuo's case, he functions well as a bot laner. I think Yasuo in general is slightly on the weaker side at the moment, as Yasuo traditionally tends to be better in the ADC role than the mid lane. Obviously into the ranged options here, the wind wall can be very, very oppressive and can enable him to really comfortably survive the lane and then utilize his almost skirmisher playstyle to find angles onto backline and be really valuable in those aspects. He just says more like a B tier option though at the moment. The A tier then, we're going to lead off with the mages. We have things like Brand, who I have here because of his simplicity. He can output a huge amount of dot damage. He has been nerfed quite a few times now, and you could consider him a B tier champion, especially if you're not if you're not really comfortable with a pick. But if you pair him with something like a Nami, he can be really valuable. He's more on the easier side. The higher up you go, he's definitely going to struggle more, and I'd recommend other mages over him. Ziggs, for example, great sieger, great AP damage, can work really nicely into specific marksmen. Veigar, really good in low elo, kind of akin to Brand. Both these champions, the higher up you go, can drop down the tier list. Lux, I also believe, is slightly better in low elo, but can scale a bit better into the higher ranks. You can still functionally act as just a champion which one-shots waves, or play around her burst combo. Very, very predicated on snowballing. That is the main thing with Lux. You need a lot of gold to really be valuable within the game. And then Karthus, who's basically lost all of his play rate within the bot lane now, is still very functional here and great with pairings like Leona, but very, very niche or uncommon, and oftentimes requires a decent amount more mastery than the other 4 champions here. On the other side of the mage spectrum, I guess you could say, within the A tier, you have things like Quay and Seraphine and Swain. Actually, I've dropped Seraphine and Swain down. I think Seraphine I still had slightly overrated ever since the 10% AP ratio nerf to her Q. Swain got nerfed this patch, so he drops from the S tier to the A tier. He's definitely not performing as well now. The armor nerf does really hurt him primarily in the bot lane, so yeah, drops from S tier to the A tier, but can be great into short range compositions where he can really utilize the power of his ultimate and more consistency within the within his abilities. Seraphine, great as like a utility AP option here, with good CC and good shielding and healing. So solid A tier option for both of them. Hui, I think, is like my underrated A tier pick at the moment. I think this champion is in a really, really good spot, and more people should play him in the bot lane. The only reason I reckon he hasn't been nerfed for his bot lane strength is because he's relatively unpopular. Victor, I also have. Okay, so Victor's an interesting one. I think Victor, pre-hotfix, is a S tier bot laner. He looks really, really strong in this role. Obviously, the data in the previous patch made it kind of impossible to really know just how well he would operate here. But there's been a large amount of game sample sizes now, and I've been able to see and watch people play it, and it does pretty well. The armor growth and the health growth are going to hurt him more in mid lane, where he's going to get access to levels, but they do hurt him bot lane as well, where you are playing into more AD threats traditionally. So I would say he's probably going to drop to a high A tier option. I actually will leave him in the S tier for the moment, though. The marksman options are things like Ashe, who is, I'd say, slightly on the downwards at the moment. They tagged her slightly, but she is being changed quite heavily going into next season. So it'll be interesting to see where she lands. But she's still a great utility marksman option, so I don't think she's by any means bad, but you might not be outputting as much DPS as some of the other options at the moment. Sivir, I think, is underrated. MF as well. I think both these champions are actually slightly better than A tier, especially in low elo. Like, if this was pure low elo tier list, I would have MF and Sivir in the S tier. I think these champions operate really well there. But because it kind of encapsulates more towards Diamond as well, I think MF and Sivir are slightly worse the higher up you go. But they're still relatively underrated champions, so I do have them as A tier options. And then Jinx, I also still have as an A tier option. I think this champion isn't quite S tier. She still requires quite a bit of snowballing to really come online, but if you can get her items, get like 2, 3, 4 items, she can really take over games and be quite an oppressive champion. Her trading patterns are a bit more awkward compared to other bot laners. You are playing more around just your raw auto damage and splash damage more than anything, but if you can find those angles in laning phase, abusing her like rocket range, for example, she could be a very powerful pick and a very solid A tier option. Caitlyn, Jhin, Kog'Maw, Nyla are my S tier picks. They remain from last patch. I think Jhin and honestly, okay, so the problem with the bot lane at the moment is I don't really think there's actually any standout picks in the current state of the game. I think there are slightly underrated options like your Sivirs and your MFs. But I think the S tier at the moment is pretty close to the A tier. Like, it's the closest I reckon it's probably ever been. I think most bot laners, like within A, S, and even kind of encapsulating B, all have a place where they can be very functional. I think the C tier options are definitely on a tier below, but things like Varus, Kai'Sa, Aphelios, like I said, can definitely operate at the say like a relatively equal level the higher up you go. And Callista, very, very elite skewed, but like if you can still make the champion work. The other 5 picks here I think are a bit weaker, but overall the bot lane's in a relatively like most things can be played if you find the right spots for it. Obviously, things like Jhin operate more as a utility. High damage option doesn't have the same level of DPS that like almost any other marksman's going to put out, but can still be very valuable in the right spots. And he does have some alternating builds. Same goes for Ashe. We've seen like static Yomus pop up a bit more. It might be worth trying that, and that can definitely push the champion up a bit. Kog'Maw has the AP build, which was primarily strong for its laning phase, where it basically made him unassailable. That did get tagged, and it is worse now, but it can still definitely be something opted into in the right spots. Other than that, you're playing more traditionally just on-hit Kog'Maw. Nyla has great pairings, and I think that really promotes her as a good option. Maybe not S tier. I think with her option, she is almost like an S plus option, but then take away her pairings, like your Tarics, your Sennas, for example, she drops more to like an A tier pick. And then Caitlyn, it's probably the recommended go-to, just traditional marksman at the moment, but the nerfs towards her ultimate did hurt her, combined with Collector being nerfed. That was another tag on the champion, so she's not quite as cut and dry the best marksman in the game. I think there is definitely a lot of flexibility to be had, and like you can really choose between, like, depending on what kind of play style you're aiming for, and that can be your way of finding success. If you want my pick of the patch, for low, like if you're like climbing from like, let's say, silver to emerald, I would recommend something like Sivir MF. If you're like more like diamond, I still think things like Caitlyn, Jinx are great options. If you're looking to splash a mage in, things like Victor, Hui, very solid bot lane options. Definitely worth learning if you like long term, if they maintain their same level of power. And if you want something with a bit more utility, I think Ashe and Jhin are great options. Overall, those are my thoughts. So thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.